Well, as I mentioned last week, and as Dub mentioned in the prayer just now, we're going to be taking a look at the story of Joseph. And I teased you a little bit last week by saying, well, is it really the story of Joseph? And I'm not going to tell you just yet whether it is or not, but maybe by the end of tonight, we'll have a good answer to that question. Before we get into that story itself, I wanted to talk a little bit about a common way that Bible writers use to emphasize important ideas. And in fact, we do the same thing. If you want your kids to do something, you probably don't tell them to do it once. You probably repeat yourself. And you might end up repeating yourself more than you'd really like to. But the idea is that the more often people hear something, the more likely they are to remember it. And this is true in our Old Testament stories as well. Sometimes that repetition takes the form of repeated words and phrases, but sometimes entire stories bear a resemblance to each other, or at least share some common elements that cause us to think about them together. Those commonalities invite us to look more closely at the stories, and upon closer examinations, oftentimes the differences between those stories stand out. And in Bible writings, those differences often aid our interpretation of the story. We can observe this kind of thing all over the Old Testament especially, but today we'll be looking specifically at the story of Joseph in Genesis chapters 37 through 50. We're also going to take a look back, though, at the patriarchs. We'll set the stage just a little bit. And I'd like to highlight some of the events of the stories of the patriarchs because they're repeated, at least to some degree, in the Joseph story, or they lay the foundation for some of the tension that arises in the Joseph story. So let's go all the way back to Abraham. We started this class taking a look at the life of Abraham, talking about his journey of faith. And Abraham, what have you seen? Causing us to think about what is it that caused Abraham to be willing at one point to try to raise up a child from another wife. And then when he finally gets the child of the promise, Isaac, he's willing to sacrifice him. What changed? What have you seen, Abraham? If you recall that story. So let's take a look at some other elements of the story of Abraham. We remember that there's a promise that God makes to him. There's actually several. One involving land, one involving a nation, but in the chapter 15 edition of that promise, we learn that there's going to be slavery in Egypt. His family will become a nation in Egypt, but they will be enslaved there. We remember that he once said, "She's my sister," talking about his wife when they went down to Egypt. We remember that Ishmael was actually his firstborn through Hagar, but the promise of God belongs to Isaac. Wait a minute, he said, "She's my sister" again, a second time in the story. And we remember that Sarah was barren for many, many years, but eventually she bears the child of the promise. So those are some key elements from the story of Abraham. We move on to the story of Isaac, his son. Isaac finds his wife, Rebekah, at a well. Actually, he doesn't find her, but the family finds her there and brings her home to become his wife. Rebekah, like Sarah, is barren, but eventually bears the child of the promise. Actually, she bears twins, right? Esau and Jacob. And Esau was the firstborn, like Ishmael, in that sense. But the promise belongs to Jacob, just as the promise belonged to Isaac, the second-born of Abraham. Isaac prefers Esau, but Rebekah prefers Jacob. Like father, like son, Isaac tries to pass his wife off as his sister. So let's look at some of the common elements between these stories. We have barren wives who eventually bear children. We have a firstborn son who's not favored. We have deception. Let's move on to the story of Jacob. Jacob blackmails Esau for his birthright. Jacob deceives Isaac for a blessing. Jacob himself personally finds Rachel at a well. Laban deceives Jacob, giving Jacob Leah first as his wife instead of Rachel, who Jacob thought he was getting. Jacob prefers Rachel. Rachel is barren, but eventually bears two sons, Joseph and Benjamin. Jacob deceives Laban. He leaves without giving him any notice, taking his daughters and grandchildren and everything else away, or at least attempting to, until Laban chases him down. Jacob deceives Esau again. Remember, they met up again. Seemed to be somewhat reconciled, given that Esau at one point wanted to kill Jacob. But then Jacob says, you go on before me and I'll meet you down there. But then he doesn't go. Right? So he deceived him again by not rendezvousing with him. Well, we have the barren wife again. We have, as we'll see, a firstborn son who's not favored. We have deception. We have wives found at wells. And we have favoritism. So these are some common elements in the stories of the patriarchs. So all of that to say, be on the lookout as we look at the story of Joseph tonight, to see where some of these commonalities in their forefathers' stories might pop up again. So as we get ready to go through the story of Joseph, let me just kind of give you the flow of events of the story. Chapter 37 opens and we find out that Joseph is a tattler. He tells on his brothers and gets them in trouble. His father dotes on him, treats him with favoritism, gives him the coat of many colors. Joseph has some dreams, which he tells his brothers and his mother and father. And his brothers especially don't like this. They hate him for it. In fact, they plot against him to kill him when they see him coming to see them with the herds. They decide not to kill him, instead sell him to slave traders. Okay, well hey, they didn't kill him. They just traded him to people who usually ended up killing the people that they had in their charge. But Joseph finds his way down to Egypt, into Potiphar's house. He does well. He rises to become the chief of the house, but then he's propositioned by Potiphar's wife, framed for a misdeed that he didn't actually engage in, and finds himself in prison. But even in prison, Joseph rises to the top and becomes a chief person there, an important leader in that context. While he's there, he meets the cupbearer and the baker. And both of those guys have dreams that Joseph interprets correctly. The cupbearer resumes his position. The baker doesn't, right? In fact, he dies. But when the cupbearer gets his position back, he fails to remember Joseph and doesn't speak positively about him in order to free him from the prison. A little while later, though, Pharaoh has some dreams. The cupbearer remembers, hey, there was this guy in prison who could interpret dreams. Maybe we ought to check things out with him. They pull Joseph out of prison. He interprets those dreams. There's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. Pharaoh asks him what he should do about that. Joseph gives a wise answer, and so Pharaoh elevates Joseph to a high position. Seems like everywhere Joseph goes, he ends up in a leadership sort of a position. He rises to the top. Joseph's brothers eventually come down to Egypt during the time of the famine, but Joseph doesn't reveal himself to them. In fact, he accuses them of being spies. He questions them. He puts them to the test. Eventually, he forces them to leave Simeon with him, one of the brothers, and send them back home. He puts their money back in their sacks, and they return to Jacob. And the only way that they can come back and get more food is if they bring their youngest brother, Benjamin, with them. Initially, Jacob's unwilling to do that. So eventually they get hungry enough that they decide they must do that. So Joseph's brothers return to Egypt a second time, this time bringing Benjamin with them. They get called to Joseph's house. They end up having a meal with him, but Joseph still doesn't reveal his identity to them. He puts their money back in their sacks. He puts the silver cup into Benjamin's sack, and they depart. But he sends his steward after them, brings them back because they found the money, because they found the cup in the sack, and they think they're going to get it. And through a strange turn of events that we'll talk more about later, Joseph reveals his identity. They're reunited, and he sends them to fetch Jacob. Now, you might remember last week that I mentioned that this is my favorite story in the Old Testament, but based on the way I just related those events of the story, it sure doesn't sound like a really great tale, does it? I mean, I did not tell it in any way that would make you think that it's such a great story. Of course, I went out of my way to tell you just the facts of the story in about as uninteresting a way as I possibly could so that I could make a point. The beauty of a story, as well as its meaning, has much less to do with the facts of the story than it has to do with how the story is told. They work together, the facts and the telling. But this is, if we wanted to put it into the terms that I've used throughout this study, meaning actually comes from the combination of events with accounts, the way that the story is told. And especially in this particular case, the beauty of this story is to be found at least as much in the account as it is in the events. And I want to spend the rest of our time taking a look at elements of the account, the way that the story is told. So let's back up a little bit and go over the storyline again. And here I have on the screen kind of the rundown of what I did just a couple of minutes ago. In chapter 37, the brothers sell Joseph into slavery. Joseph ends up in Potiphar's house. Then he's in the prison house. Then he's in Pharaoh's house. Finally, his brothers show up and they interact with each other in a couple of different episodes within this story. And eventually Joseph is reunited with Jacob and reconciled with his brothers. Now, if you know the story well and were able to listen carefully enough, you know that I left something out, right? And you can see it there if you just follow the chapter numbers. I left out chapter 38. The story of Judah's family and his daughter-in-law, Tamar. Do you remember how I said that Bible books are a selective retelling of stories? Well, sometimes we do that ourselves. With kids, we sometimes censor the stories, with good reason, I think. I mean, consider the story that we looked at just this past Sunday morning in Dale's sermon. That's probably not something that you tell to 5-year-old kids in Bible hour, right? They don't have any context to understand it, and it's quite disturbing to find something like that in the Bible at a young age. So we often kind of censor those stories, and I think with good reason. But sometimes we also, in essence, not so much censor, but skip stories that we don't really know how to deal with. And this is one such story. I mean, if you look at the way that this is laid out on your screen here, and you read down through those summary statements about what's involved in the story, all of those include something about Joseph except chapter 38, which deals with Judah and Tamar. And if we were just reading these stories primarily as history, that seems really odd. It seems out of place. It's like, there was this story, it's part of the oral tradition, we're getting ready to write all this stuff down. I think we'll stick it here, right? But that's not what happened. In fact, if we're reading these stories as stories, and especially as ancient Hebrew stories, following their techniques of storytelling, this story makes perfect sense. In fact, it's absolutely vital, crucial to the understanding of this larger story. Let me explain. We'll go back into chapter 37, which I've already kind of highlighted, but we're going to go through it a little bit more slowly. I mentioned that Joseph tattles. He tells on his brothers. He brings a bad report of them to his father. And that certainly doesn't endear him to his brothers. Then he has these dreams where everybody is bowing down to him. And it wouldn't be so bad if he just had the dreams, but he decided that it was a really good idea to tell his brothers and his father and his mother these dreams. And it says multiple times, and his brothers hated him all the more for his dreams and for his words. And of course, it also doesn't help that he's the prized child of the father, and everybody knows it. He's the one that gets the coat of many colors. In the story in chapter 37, it flat out says that the brothers recognized that Joseph was the favored son of Jacob, and they were jealous of him. Well, eventually Jacob sends Joseph to check on his brothers who are tending the flocks. His brothers see him coming and they conspire to kill him. Now Reuben attempts to intercede. As we find out later, he actually has his own motives. He's not exactly pure of heart when he attempts to intercede, but he does attempt to. Apparently, he steps out of the scene for long enough that when the Ishmaelites come along, Judah offers another path. He says, hey, let's not kill him. Let's not get our hands dirty with his blood. Let's just sell him into slavery. So they sold Joseph for silver to the Ishmaelites who were on their way down to Egypt. And this is what we read about what happened when the sons returned home. Then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in the blood. And they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this we have found. Please recognize whether it is your son's robe or not. And he recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. A fierce animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments and put sackcloth on his loins and mourned for his son many days. All his sons and all his daughters rose up to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son, mourning. Thus his father wept for him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. There are a few key words I want to point out in here. How is Jacob deceived? What did they use to deceive Jacob?
You mean like goat's blood? Is that what you're talking about?
They used a goat and a garment, right? His robe, they dipped the blood. They dipped the robe in the blood. Now, does this sound in any way familiar? Somebody deceiving their father using parts of a goat and a garment. Doesn't it force you to recall Jacob deceiving Isaac with the goat skin that he wore on his arms in order to deceive him into giving him the birthright? The blessing. Jacob, who at every step in his life, even all the way up to this point, has deceived time after time after time. His own father, his brother, Laban, everyone. And in fact, when he deceived his father Isaac, he deceived him using a garment and a goat. But now the deceiver is deceived. Notice also that the brothers don't actually lie. They don't tell the truth, but they don't lie, do they? They simply present the garment and say, recognize this. Is this the garment that belonged to Joseph? Jacob recognized it and he drew his own conclusion. later on in the story, we probably won't have time to pause and take a closer look at it. But when the brothers go down to Egypt and they present themselves to Joseph and he starts accusing them of being spies, they say, no, we're honest men. Well, they're anything but honest, except they didn't actually lie. They didn't say, we found this garment and a wild animal has killed Joseph. They simply present it, and Jacob draws the conclusion. Kind of an interesting element of the story, right? Sorry. So we come to the so-called Misfit story that I think is actually crucial to the larger story. So let's take a closer look at it. Now, at the end of chapter 37, we know that Joseph has been sold to Potiphar in Egypt, he's an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard. But in the very next verse, we simply turn to an entirely different setting. We find out a little bit more about Judah. He marries a Canaanite and has 3 sons. His first son marries Tamar, but that son is evil and God kills him. The second son is given to Tamar as husband in order to raise up an heir for his brother, but he doesn't do it, so God kills him. Judah says, that's enough. My third son, he's not old enough yet. Tamar, you go home. When he's old enough, I'll give him to you. As we find out, that didn't happen. And what he did to her in the first place was shameful anyway. He should have brought her into his own house. But he doesn't give his third son later. And so here we have Judah practicing the family pastime, essentially, deception. And we come to chapter 38, verse 12. In the course of time, the wife of Judah, Shua's daughter, died. When Judah was comforted, he went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, he and his friend Hira the Adullamite. And when Tamar was told, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear his sheep, she took off her widow's garments and covered herself with a veil, wrapping herself up, and sat at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah, the son, was grown up, and she had not been given to him in marriage. The story continues. When Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. He turned to her at the roadside and said, come, let me come in to you, for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. She said, what will you give me that you may come in to me? He answered, I will send you a young goat from the flock. And she said, if you will give me a pledge until you send it. He said, what pledge shall I give you? She replied, your signet and your cord and your staff that is in your hand. So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and went away, taking off her veil. She put on the garments of her widowhood. Key events and words that we see in this story. Judah went down from his brothers. He deceives Tamar regarding the third son. Tamar deceives Judah. Remember, he doesn't recognize her. She puts on different clothes and has her face covered. So again, we have the deceiver being deceived. Again, that deception involves a garment and a goat. A little bit differently, this time it's Tamar's garments and the goat that he is supposed to give to her as part of the transaction. This occurs at a place called Enaim, which means twin wells. Perhaps this is an allusion to stories of the patriarchs finding wives at wells, only this time the meetup results in a simple sexual transaction rather than in a marriage. And interestingly enough, if we read a little bit further, we'd see that it produced twin boys. So, some interesting ideas in here. Judah tries to send her the goat later as payment, but he can't deliver it. By the way, this signet and cord and the staff, that's kind of the modern day equivalent of that would be giving all of your credit cards to somebody. Right? These are all the things that are part of his identity. They are also things that he would have worn on him. So in one sense, they're sort of like a garment, being involved in this transaction. Well, what happens? About 3 months later, Judah was told, Tamar, your daughter-in-law, has been immoral. Moreover, she is pregnant by immorality. And Judah said, loving father-in-law that he is, bring her out and let her be burned. That's his response. But as she was being brought out, she sent word to her father-in-law, by the man to whom these belong, I am pregnant. And she said, please recognize whose these are, the signet and the cord and the staff. Then Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he did not know her again. Notice that these back-to-back stories have elements of deception coupled with statements about recognizing. We're supposed to read these kind of against each other and understand that there is a connection between these stories based on the words that are used to tell it. And so with that, Joseph becomes the focus of the text for the next several chapters, starting with another familiar story in chapter 39. Now, chapters 38 and 39 are the ones that really very closely go together. This whole idea of recognition ties it back to chapter 37, but chapter 39 is one that we're really supposed to read over and against chapter 38. So let's take a look at it. Starting in chapter 39, verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him an overseer of his house and put in his hands all that he had. From the time that he made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's hands, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food that he ate. So I've highlighted several things here. One of the things that I want to point out right now is if you look back at the story of Tamar and Judah, where were the things that he gave to her? They were in your hand, right? When we get to the story of Joseph, Potiphar leaves everything in his hands. We know that he's in Potiphar's house, and over and over and over again, we see that the Lord was with Joseph. We have that statement made in several different ways in these few verses. Well, then we read that Potiphar's wife tries repeatedly to seduce Joseph, who refuses her. But one day, continuing on in verse 11, when he went into the house to do his work and none of the men of the house was there in the house, she caught him by his garment, saying, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and fled and got out of the house. And as soon as she saw that he had left his garment in her hand and had fled out of the house, she called to the men of her household and said to them, see, he has brought among us a Hebrew to laugh at us. He came in to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And as soon as he heard that, I lifted up my voice and cried out. He left his garment beside me and fled and got out of the house. Then she laid up his garment by her until his master came home, and she told him the same story, saying, the Hebrew servant whom you have brought among us came in to me to laugh at me. But as soon as I lifted up my voice and cried, he left his garment beside me and fled out of the house. Now, Joseph had been taken down to Egypt. Remember, Judah went down to the area of near Timnah when he found his wife. So we have those parallels in the beginnings of those stories, some common words, some common introductions to the way that the story plays out. We have parallel ideas at the beginning and end of chapter 39 about, and we'll get there a little bit further when we read some more, verses 19 through 23, that God continues to be with Joseph. Joseph is done in by deception involving a garment again. But look at the story. Where was the garment? In her hand. When did she cry out? After he left his garment in her hand and fled out of the house. Then she called to the men of her house. But when she retells the story, he comes in, she cries out, and he left his garment beside me. It's not in my hand. She changes the story, right? And that highlights the in the hand versus beside me and causes us to remember back to the previous chapter where were Judah's items that he gave in exchange for the transaction for sex. It had to do with his the things that were in his hand, the staff that was in his hand. Again, we see repeated use of the word house. Where is all this taking place? It's in the house. Well, what happens next? As soon as his master heard the words that his wife spoke to him, "This is the way your servant treated me," his anger was kindled. And Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison house. And most translations will just say something like prison. It actually doesn't even say prison. It says house. Same word that's used previously. The place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in the prison house. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him steadfast love and gave him favor in the sight of the captain of the prison house. Now, he had already been in the house of the captain of Pharaoh's army, or one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain. Now he's with the captain of the prison house. And the captain of the prison house put in Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison house, and whatever was done there, he was the one who did it. The captain of the prison house paid no attention to anything that was in Joseph's hand because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it succeed. All right. Do you see how these stories mesh together because of the words that are used very intentionally to tell them? The events of the story themselves have some parallels too, right? Judah goes out, he finds somebody and pays for sex. Joseph has it offered to him for free and refuses. And we have all these other words to tie it together that help us to make the connection between the stories. Notice that if we were to read this a little bit more closely, we would find out that another word that's used, at least when Joseph is talking about the prison, later in chapter 40, when he refers back to it, he calls it the pit. What had his brothers thrown him into while they waited to decide what to do to him? They threw him in a pit. This is the second time he's been thrown into a pit. Again, without his garment. Right? First the coat of many colors, then the one that he left in the hand of Potiphar's wife. We don't have nearly enough time to go into it, but pairs of events, parallel events, run all through this story. I'm only going to mention a couple of them. I made a list of them one time. It turns out somewhere around 20 different instances of pairs of events that you can find in this story. All right. So we've read these two chapters over and against each other, and we can see how they're tied together with the words that are used to tell them. The writer uses allusions to similar elements of previous stories to signal that each scene should be read in light of the others. And in the case of these back-to-back stories in chapters 38 and 39, the writer tells us he uses something called narrative analogy to characterize Joseph and Judah. Notice the writer doesn't say, now Joseph was more righteous than Judah. He doesn't ever say that directly. But that's exactly the point that he makes indirectly. The Judah and Tamar story is not out of place. It's not some interlude while we wait for Joseph to appear in Egypt. It is, in fact, crucial to understanding the larger story. In fact, it seems that one purpose of this section of Genesis is actually to explain how Judah became preeminent among the brothers and later the tribes, and even later the nation. If we skip over to chapter 49, after the family is reunited in Egypt and Jacob is about to die, we read about Jacob blessing his sons. Now, for the record, if these are blessings, I don't want to hear the curses, at least for the first few, because it's going to be kind of interesting. But this is how he blesses his firstborn son, Reuben. This is from, I'm not going to show all of this on the screen, but you can follow along. Chapter 49, verses 3 and the beginning of verse 4. Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the first fruit of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power, unstable as water. You shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. What's he talking about? Well, you can read about that in Genesis chapter 35. It doesn't even comprise a full verse. It's just part of a verse. But this is what it says. While Israel lived in that land, Israel being Jacob, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. That's all it says. But if you know that's in the backstory and you think about Reuben in the scene where they're debating what to do with Joseph, why do you think he wants to intervene? I think he kind of has something that he wants to make up to his father. He doesn't want to be part of another thing that puts him in the doghouse with dad. He's already in a bad enough state the way things are. Well, what about his second and third sons, Simeon and Levi? This is how he blesses them in chapter 49, verses 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul come not into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. Cursed be their anger, for it is fierce, and their wrath, for it is cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel. Well, what does he have against Simeon and Levi? Well, we could go back to Genesis chapter 34 and look at their response to the way Shechem treated their sister Dinah. He did defile her. They were angry about this. But then they pulled some of the family trick, right? They deceived the people and slaughtered many of them. And as Jacob said, you've made us a stench in the nostrils of the people that we're living among. So, children 1, 2, and 3, sons 1, 2, and 3, are in daddy's doghouse, and they didn't get out of it before he died. Genesis chapter 49, these are his last words that we have recorded to his sons, and then he will die. Well, who's next? Judah. Now, based on the story so far, we probably don't have a very good opinion of Judah either, do we? I mean, he was the one who pragmatically said, well, let's just sell him and get him off of our hands without actually shedding his blood. And then he went to a prostitute who just happened to be his daughter-in-law. Okay, but here's what Jacob says about Judah in chapter 49, verses 8 through 12. I'll probably just read the first few verses of this, the first verse or so. Judah, your brothers shall praise you. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's son shall bow down before you. And he keeps on going, praising him, extolling his good attributes, and so forth. And we get the idea that Judah is going to be the one who's preeminent. It says, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet. So Judah is going to be the one that's preeminent. He's the one who actually gets the blessing from Jacob. But why? I mean, how is he any better than Reuben, Simeon, or Levi? And what about Joseph? He seems to be the best of the lot, doesn't he? Why don't Joseph's descendants become preeminent in Israel? Well, we have to keep reading. So let's go back to the story and pick it up in chapter 42. I mean, we'll skip over some of the stuff in 40 and 41. We're probably all familiar with the story of Joseph's ability to interpret dreams, which first frees the cupbearer, and then after 2 years provides him with an opportunity to get out of jail by interpreting Pharaoh's dreams. Eventually, in chapter 42, Joseph's brothers, but without Benjamin, come to Egypt looking for food during the famine. And this is what we read. Now, Joseph was governor over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him. Wait a minute. Dreams. Dreams of a crazy young kid. Dreams that they hated him for. What just happened? They came and bowed down to him. The dream came true. At least in part. I'll tell you why it's only in part in a few minutes. They bowed themselves before him with their faces to the ground. Joseph saw his brothers and recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke roughly to them. Where do you come from? He said. They said, from the land of Canaan to buy food. And Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. Okay, clearly recognize is a key word here again. The brothers bow. Joseph accuses them of being spies. He imprisons Simeon. Who's the deceiver now? Who's the deceiver now? Even Joseph, the one that God favors, the one who God blesses, deceives his brothers. Let's keep reading. This is verses 18 through 24. On the third day, Joseph said to them, do this and you will live, for I fear God. If you are honest men, which they claim to be, I mentioned that earlier, let one of your brothers remain confined where you are in custody, and let the rest go and carry grain for the famine of your households, and bring your youngest brother to me. So your words will be verified, and you shall not die. And they did so. Then they said to one another, in truth, we are guilty concerning our brother, in that we saw the distress of his soul when he begged us and we did not listen. That is why this distress has come upon us. And Reuben answered them, did I not tell you not to sin against the boy? But you did not listen. So now there comes a reckoning for his blood. But they did not know that Joseph understood them, for there was an interpreter between them. Then he turned away from them and wept, and he returned to them and spoke to them. And he took Simeon from them and bound him before their eyes. So they make a connection between what they did and what they are beginning to suffer now. They recognize their guilt. And we find out something that's not in the story in chapter 37. Joseph is completely silent as far as chapter 37 goes. Only now do we find out that he was calling to them, begging them not to do whatever it was they were going to do to him. And they sat there and listened to it and ignored it. So he releases everyone except Simeon and demands that Benjamin be brought back to him. He replaces their money in their sacks of grain and sends them home. Jacob refuses to send Benjamin, and Reuben decides, hey, well, Dad, if I take Benjamin with me and I don't come back, you can kill my sons. You can kill them if I don't bring Benjamin back. You can read about that in chapter 42, verse 37.
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, thanks, Dad. Jacob refuses again to send Benjamin because he is the only one left. That's a direct quote from Jacob. Well, he's the only one left except the other 10 sons, right? Now, of course, he's talking about sons of the favored wife, Rachel, but still, you guys, I'm not all that concerned about. Benjamin, I'm not giving him a period, right? He's the only son I have remaining from my favored wife. Well, time passes, and Jacob tells his sons to return to Egypt for food, and Judah says, we can't go if we don't take Benjamin. And then he says something interesting in verse 8 and 9 of chapter 43. And Judah said to Israel, his father, send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you and also our little ones. I will be a pledge for his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever." Maybe there's some hope for Judah. He's at least better than Reuben. He doesn't offer up more death as compensation for not coming back with Benjamin. Well, in 43:11 through 15, we see some parallels between Joseph's trip to Egypt and the one that his brothers take. If you look at those stories, they take the same stuff. It's the same list of things that the Ishmaelites took with them down to Egypt, but now it's Jacob's other sons going down to Egypt with the favored son, the brother of the one who went before. So we have a favored son of Jacob going down to Egypt with a caravan that includes all the same stuff. 2 trips. The brothers return to Egypt. They bow twice to Joseph. Still don't know who he is. They eat, they get their grain. Joseph replaces the money again. He puts the cup in Benjamin's sack. The brothers leave only to be stopped by Joseph's steward. The steward accuses them of stealing Joseph's cup. And the brothers protest and they say, the one who has it will die and the rest of us will become slaves. They're so sure that it won't happen that they make that rash protest. The steward agrees. His words say, "Let it be as you say," but then what he says back to them is not exactly the same. He changes the terms. The one who has it will be the slave and the others will go free. And then they find it in Benjamin's sack and they're brought before Joseph. And Judah tries to change the deal again. Judah said, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found." What is he trying to do? We're all gonna be prisoners. We're all gonna become your servants. But what guilt is he talking about? They didn't put the cup in his sack. What guilt is he talking about? The same one they were talking about previously when they said, "We're getting payback for what we did wrong." Judah says it a second time. Here's another pair. And so Judah, there are too many J's in this story, by the way. Judah says, "Look, we're just all going to be your servants." He's thinking about having to go back to dad without Benjamin. He'd probably just rather all of them stay there. But Joseph refuses that. And he says, "No, Benjamin stays and the others are free." And it seems that a likely aspect of this is that Joseph is attempting to save Benjamin from the brothers who did him so wrong. I'll keep Benjamin here with me and protect my brother from the rest of them. It never is stated clearly, but that seems to be a reasonable motive for the way that he acts. Finally, we arrive at the climax of the story, and Judah begins to speak, and it's a long section. We're going to start in chapter 44, verse 18. Then Judah went up to him and said, "O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in my Lord's ears. And let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servant, saying, 'Have you a father or a brother?' And we said to my Lord, 'We have a father, an old man, and a young brother, the child of his old age. His brother is dead, and he alone is left of his mother's children, and his father loves him.' Then you said to your servants, 'Bring him down to me, that I may set my eyes on him.' We said to my Lord, 'The boy cannot leave his father. For if he should leave his father would die.' Then you said to your servants, 'Unless your youngest brother comes down with you, you shall not see my face again.'" And that meant they could get no food. "When we went back to your servant, my father, we told him the words of my Lord. And when our father said, 'Go again, buy us a little food,' we said, 'We cannot go down, If our youngest brother goes with us, then we will go down, for we cannot see the man's face unless our youngest brother is with us. Then your servant, my father, said to us, you know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he has been torn to pieces, and I have never seen him since. If you take this one also from me, isn't that an interesting turn of phrase? If you take this one also from me, and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs and evil to Sheol. Now, therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up in the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy is not with us, he will die. And your servants will bring down the gray hairs of your servant, our father, with sorrow to Sheol. For your servant, I, became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then I shall bear the blame before my father all my life. Now, therefore, please let me, your servant, remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy is not with me? I fear to see the evil that would find my father. Wow. Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him. He cried, make everyone go out from me. So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept aloud so that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive? But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. What a beautiful story. Judah concocted a plan to sell his brother into slavery and later arranged to buy his daughter-in-law for sex. He participated in deceiving his father about Joseph's fate. He watched Joseph suffer for more than 20 years, thinking his beloved son was dead. But as the story builds toward its climax, we find Judah offering to be the object of guilt if harm befalls Benjamin on their journey. And when that harm appears imminent, he offers himself in place of the favored son. He knows full well what his standing is before his father relative to the other child, Benjamin, doesn't he? His speech made it very clear that he knows where he stands relative to this favored son of Jacob. But what a remarkable change unfolds before our eyes. What a wonderful story of redemption brought about by sacrificial selflessness. Do we find a similar story anywhere else in Scripture? Perhaps in a descendant of David, who himself was a descendant of Judah. Oh, and he was a descendant of Judah via Perez, the son of Judah and Tamar. Perez was one of the twins fathered by Judah with Tamar. And he is an ancestor of David, who's an ancestor of Christ, who also left everything, sacrificed everything, traded himself essentially to be the sacrifice for us. So what do we make of all this? I think the story functions on several levels. Most simplistically, we have a really wonderful story about the reconciliation of a really messed up family. We also have an explanation for how Israel, the nation, ended up in Egypt, as was foretold in the promise to Abraham in Genesis 15. And when we see what happens with Judah, how he went from being a very selfish person to becoming the one who was willing to trade himself for to take the place of the favored son, we understand why Judah is worthy to rise to prominence among the sons of Jacob, even though he wasn't the firstborn. But there's something even bigger going on here. And Joseph summarizes the big picture in chapter 50. And he expresses what I believe to be the main theological message of the story. Starting in chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "It may be that Joseph will hate us and pay us back for all the evil that we did to him." So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father gave this command before he died." We have no record of this command, by the way, so it seems like it's a fabrication, the family engaging in its favorite pastime again, deception. "Say to Joseph, please forgive the transgression of your brothers and their sin because they did evil to you. And now, please forgive the transgression of the servants of the God of your father." And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. And his brothers also came and fell down before him. This is the first time they bowed down to him, knowing who he is. The dream really comes true here. Remember back, his dreams were these sheaves and all this other, they bowed down to me. They now bow down to him as Joseph. And they said, "Behold, we are your servants." But Joseph said to them, "Do not fear, for am I in the place of God? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive, as they are today. So do not fear. I will provide for you and your little ones." Thus he comforted them and spoke kindly to him. Joseph says to his brothers that what they did to him was all part of God's plan to preserve many people alive, including the people of his promise. God can use the behavior of people who intend to do evil to work his purposes in his creation. He is in control. That's the theological message of the story. What an awesome God we serve. What an awesome book he's given us through which he reveals himself to us. What an awesome story of redemption that we have here. I've really enjoyed teaching this series of lessons. I hope I was able to communicate something of the depth of detail that exists in these marvelous stories that God has provided to us. There's lots of good stuff in these stories beyond the Flannelgraph, which was the whole point of this series, to take a closer look, to kind of dig into some of the details that maybe we haven't looked at before, because we've kind of been shaped by our earlier experiences of listening to these stories. Beautiful story in this particular case of Joseph and Judah. I think the story is actually about Judah, told through the lens of what happened to Joseph. To be sure, he's a key part of the story. The events that surround him are critical. But the story is about Judah. And even beyond that, the story is about God.